Dr. Marcus Webb had been working as a xenolinguist on the diplomatic station orbiting Velthara Prime for 3 years, which meant he'd successfully avoided any situation that might be described as politically significant for approximately 1,095 days. Then the reactor malfunctioned, and his careful record of diplomatic insignificance ended abruptly. Marcus was 38, scholarly by nature, with 15 years of experience studying alien languages and helping navigate the cultural misunderstandings that made interspecies relations complicated. He specialized in the subtle differences between literal translation and cultural meaning, the way the same words could mean completely different things depending on context, tone, and the unspoken assumptions each species brought to communication. The Velthari were a particularly fascinating study. They were a proud warrior culture with draconic ancestry, scaled skin that could shift colors with emotional states, impressive stature that made even tall humans feel small, and a society built entirely around concepts of strength, honor, and ritual traditions that dated back millennia. Their current ruler, Empress Carathan the Eternal, had maintained power for 60 years through combination of military brilliance and political ruthlessness that made human politics look gentle by comparison. The day the reactor failed, Marcus had been working in his office analyzing dialectical variations in Velthari formal speech patterns when the station's emergency systems activated. Reactor malfunction, cascading system failures, immediate evacuation protocols for affected sections. Marcus was near the emergency response center, so he stayed to help coordinate evacuations rather than heading immediately to escape pods. That's when he heard that someone was trapped in Section 7, which was rapidly depressurizing. The security feeds showed a young Velthari female, civilian clothes, separated from the evacuation groups, trapped behind a malfunctioning blast door. The station's emergency coordinator was trying to route rescue teams, but section damage was worse than anticipated. It would take at least an hour to reach her, and she probably didn't have that long. Marcus knew Section 7's layout better than most. He'd spent weeks mapping the station's architecture for a linguistic project about how physical space influenced Velthari communication patterns. He knew secondary access routes that rescue teams might not have considered. He told the coordinator he could reach her faster, and before anyone could tell him this was a terrible idea, he was moving through damaged corridors towards Section 7. Getting there required navigating through sections with failing life support, bypassing damaged blast doors, and making several decisions that would probably look suicidal in retrospect. But Marcus had spent years studying Velthari culture, and one thing he'd learned was that they respected action over calculation when lives were at stake. Besides, someone was trapped and scared, and he could reach her. That made it simple. He found her in what had been a conference room, now with one wall partially breached, atmosphere bleeding out in ways that would be fatal within the hour. She was young, early 20s in human equivalent, with the elegant features and distinctive scale patterns that Marcus's pattern recognition immediately flagged as high-status Velthari, though he didn't recognize her specifically. She was terrified, which was understandable given she was facing death by asphyxiation or explosive decompression. Marcus introduced himself in Velthari, kept his voice calm, explained he was here to help. He used emergency sealant foam to stabilize the breach temporarily, then helped her to the secondary access route he'd mapped earlier. It was a tight crawl through maintenance conduits, but it got them to a safe section with functioning life support. They had to wait there for hours while rescue operations worked through the damaged station sections. The young Velthari woman, she introduced herself as Serana, was still shaken from the near-death experience. Marcus stayed with her, talking to keep her calm, using his linguistic training to communicate in formal Velthari, because he could tell from her speech patterns she was educated and would probably find the familiar formality reassuring. He promised her she was safe now, told her she wouldn't die here, assured her repeatedly that he would stay with her until rescue arrived, that she wouldn't face this alone. These promises, spoken in Velthari formal language, were meant as comfort to someone who just faced mortality directly. When rescue operations finally reached them, Serana was calm, clearly viewing Marcus as her savior. She thanked him formally, and he brushed it off because he was just glad they'd both survived. He returned to his linguistic work once the station was stabilized. She returned to wherever she'd come from, and Marcus assumed the incident was concluded beyond perhaps receiving formal thanks from Velthari diplomatic personnel for helping one of their citizens. 3 months later, Marcus was in his office analyzing Velthari ceremonial texts when royal guards in full formal armor appeared at his door. They delivered a summons. Doctor. Marcus Webb was commanded to appear before Empress Carathan immediately. No explanation given. Just the summons, delivered with intensity that suggested refusing would create problems Marcus really didn't want. Marcus had absolutely no idea what this was about, but his stomach dropped when he realized the summons was from the Empress herself, not through diplomatic channels, not from station administration, but directly from the ruler of one of the most powerful empires in the region. He asked the guards if they could tell him the nature of the audience. Their response was that the Empress would explain, and he should come immediately. The transport to Velthara Prime gave Marcus too much time to worry about what could have prompted an imperial summons. He reviewed everything he'd done in the past 3 months, searching for anything that might have offended Velthari sensibilities or created diplomatic complications. His work was mostly linguistic analysis, not the kind of thing that usually attracted imperial attention. The imperial palace was everything Marcus expected from studying Velthari architecture. Massive scale meant to showcase power, aesthetic design to make visitors feel appropriately small before imperial authority, guards at every checkpoint with the kind of disciplined intensity that suggested they took threats seriously. Marcus was escorted through corridors that grew progressively more formal until they reached the throne room. Empress Carathan was exactly as intimidating as intelligence briefings suggested. She was imposing even by Velthari standards, easily 2.5 meters tall, with scales that shimmered between deep crimson and black, eyes that assessed Marcus with the kind of cold calculation that made him very aware she'd held power for 60 years by being smarter and more dangerous than anyone who challenged her. Princess Serana was present, standing to one side of the throne. When she saw Marcus, her expression brightened in ways that seemed completely at odds with the obvious tension in the room. Marcus's confusion intensified. Why was the young woman he'd helped during the station emergency at a formal imperial audience? The Empress didn't waste time on diplomatic pleasantries. She spoke in Velthari formal language, her voice carrying throughout the vast chamber. Why does my daughter call you husband, human? Marcus's brain completely froze. Daughter, husband. He stared at Princess Serana. The young woman from the station emergency was the Empress's daughter. And what did the Empress mean by calling him husband? The Empress continued, her tone somewhere between rage and disbelief. For 3 months, Princess Serana has insisted she is formally bonded to you. She refers to you as her husband, claims you are bound by protection oath, refuses to consider any other potential consorts. Explain yourself. Marcus stammered out that there must be some misunderstanding. He'd never claimed any relationship with Princess Serana beyond helping her during the station emergency. He was just a linguist who happened to be in the right place to assist when she was trapped. He certainly hadn't claimed to be anyone's husband. He wasn't even sure what Velthari marriage customs involved beyond what he'd read in anthropological texts. The Empress's eyes narrowed dangerously, her scales shifting to colors that Marcus's cultural training recognized as indicating barely controlled anger. Tell me exactly what you said to my daughter during that emergency. Marcus tried to remember his exact words, explained that he'd promised to keep Serana safe, told her she wouldn't die there, assured her he'd stay with her until rescue arrived. He'd been trying to keep her calm during a terrifying situation, standard crisis response for anyone trained in emergency protocols. He'd used formal Velthari because his linguistic training meant he could communicate in her language, but he hadn't meant anything beyond providing comfort and reassurance. Princess Sirana spoke, her voice clear and formal. He spoke the words of protection oath. He promised my safety during mortal peril. He fulfilled those promises with his actions, risking his own life to reach me, staying with me through hours of uncertainty. By our law and custom, such oaths constitute formal bonding when spoken between unmarried individuals during life-threatening crisis. One of the Empress's advisors, an elderly Velthari with scales that had faded to silver with age, explained in standard for Marcus's benefit. The specific phrases you used, "I will keep you safe," "You will not die here," "I will stay with you," are the traditional words of the Velthari protection bond. When spoken during genuine mortal peril by someone who then fulfills those promises through their actions, these words create formal marriage bonds under our most ancient laws. Particularly when the protected party is of royal blood, the oath becomes binding and inviolable. Marcus felt like the ground had disappeared beneath him. He'd been speaking formal Velthari to calm a frightened person during a crisis, and apparently he'd accidentally made formal marriage declarations. He tried to explain this was a cultural misunderstanding. He didn't know those phrases had that meaning. He was just using his linguistic training to provide comfort in her own language. The Empress's response was not reassuring. Velthari law does not recognize ignorance of cultural significance as invalidating formally spoken oaths, particularly when the protected party accepted the bond, and the one who spoke the oath fulfilled it through his actions. Intent matters less than the words spoken and the promises kept. From a legal standpoint, you and my daughter have been formally bonded for 3 months. Marcus's mind raced through implications. He'd accidentally married an alien princess through cultural misunderstanding. That couldn't be legally binding. Surely there were procedures for resolving such mistakes. He voiced this hopefully. The advisor explained that protection bonds were considered sacred in Velthari culture, precisely because they were based on courage demonstrated during crisis rather than political calculation. The tradition existed to honor those who showed true character when facing death. Such bonds could only be dissolved if either party formally rejected it before the royal court, acknowledging that the promises made were false or that the protected party didn't accept the bond. The Empress turned to her daughter with barely controlled fury. "You will reject this bond now, before the court and this human, so we can end this embarrassment and find you an appropriate consort." Princess Sirana's response shocked everyone in the throne room. She looked directly at her mother, her posture straightening to full royal bearing, and spoke in formal court language. "I refuse. I accepted Guardian Marcus's protection oath freely. He fulfilled every promise he made to me. I choose to honor the bond because it was formed through genuine courage and compassion rather than political calculation. This bond stands." The Empress visibly struggled to maintain composure, her scales shifting through colors that suggested multiple conflicting emotions. "You understand what you're choosing. This human has no status, no power, no ability to protect you in ways that matter in our society. You can have your choice of the Empire's greatest warriors, most brilliant strategists, most powerful nobles. Why would you insist on honoring a bond formed through accident with someone completely unsuitable?" Sirana's answer was devastating in its simplicity. "Because he kept his promises. When I was facing death, alone and terrified, he came for me without hesitation. He risked his life to reach me, stayed with me through hours of uncertainty, put my safety above his own. He didn't know I was a princess. I was in civilian clothes, separated from anything that would identify my rank. He helped me because I needed help, not because I was royalty or because he expected reward. That honest compassion, That genuine courage shone when he thought no one important would ever know. That is worth more than all the strategic marriages you could arrange. The court was absolutely silent. The Empress clearly hadn't expected her daughter to articulate such a clear and passionate defense of the bond. Marcus was trying to process that Princess Serana actively wanted to maintain a marriage bond he didn't know he'd created. The Empress tried a different approach, turning her attention to Marcus. And you, human, surely you don't want to be bound to Velthari royalty with all the complications that entails. You're a scholar. Your life is your linguistic work. Wouldn't you prefer to return to that life rather than being trapped in a political role you never sought? Reject this bond now, and you can return to your comfortable existence. No one will blame you for refusing a situation you never intended to create. Marcus realized this was a crucial moment. He could reject the bond right now. It would be legally acceptable, would resolve this impossible situation, would let him return to his comfortable life analyzing texts and helping diplomats avoid saying the wrong things. The Empress was essentially offering him an escape from complications he genuinely hadn't sought. But he looked at Princess Serana, remembered those hours during the crisis when she'd trusted him completely, when he'd made promises to keep her safe and had meant them even if he hadn't understood their full cultural significance. He saw how she was fighting for a choice she'd made freely despite enormous pressure from the most powerful person in her civilization. Marcus thought about everything he'd learned studying Velthari culture. They valued honor above almost everything else. They respected those who kept promises, who showed courage under pressure, who maintained integrity even when it was difficult. He'd made promises to Serana during that crisis, promises he'd kept. She'd chosen to honor those promises by accepting the bond, and she was standing up to her mother to maintain that choice despite consequences. How could he do less? How could he reject commitments he'd made, even if he hadn't fully understood what he was promising at the time? Wouldn't that prove he was exactly the unsuitable person the Empress claimed, someone whose word couldn't be trusted when honoring it became complicated? Marcus addressed the Empress directly, in formal Velthari. Your Majesty, I won't reject the bond. I didn't intend to create a marriage declaration when I spoke those words, but I did make promises and I did keep them. If Princess Serana chooses to honor those promises by maintaining the bond, I'll respect her choice and honor my commitments. I don't know what being consort to a Velthari princess means for a human, but I'm willing to learn if that's what my promises require. The Empress looked like she'd been physically struck. Her scales shifted through colors Marcus had never seen documented, some combination of shock, anger, and something else he couldn't identify. She'd clearly expected Marcus to take the escape she'd offered. Having both her daughter and the human refuse to reject the bond left her in an impossible position. By Velthari law, which even the Empress was bound to uphold, protection bonds could only be dissolved by mutual agreement. Both parties had just refused to provide that agreement. The bond stood, legally and culturally inviolable, binding Princess Serana and a human linguist in marriage that no one, not even the Empress, could override without both parties' consent. The Empress dismissed the court, retreating to private chambers with her advisors. Marcus and Serana were left in an antechamber under guard, not prisoners exactly, but clearly not free to leave until the Empress decided how to handle this situation. For the first time since the crisis 3 months ago, Marcus and Serana were alone together long enough to actually talk. She thanked him for not rejecting the bond, admitted she wasn't sure if he would honor it once he understood the situation fully. She explained that she'd spent 3 months since the crisis trying to understand her own feelings about what had happened. Initially, she'd thought it was just gratitude for being saved. But the more she reflected on those hours, the more she realized Marcus had shown her something she'd never experienced in the carefully controlled environment of royal life. Someone seeing her as a person in need, rather than a princess to be honored or a political asset to be leveraged. When she'd realized his words had constituted protection bond under their ancient laws, she'd been surprised but also glad. It gave her a choice. Velthari royal marriages were almost always strategic arrangements, decided by political necessity rather than personal preference. But protection bonds were different, sacred, based on courage and character demonstrated during crisis, and they couldn't be overridden by political convenience. By accepting Marcus's oath, she'd claimed a choice for herself that she'd never have otherwise. She could choose her consort based on character proven through genuine actions, rather than having one assigned based on political expediency. Marcus admitted he was completely overwhelmed. 3 months ago, he'd been a linguist having a relatively normal day. Then there was a crisis, and he'd helped someone because that's what decent people do. And now apparently he was married to an alien princess through protection bond he hadn't known he was creating. He had no idea how to be anyone's husband, let alone consort to alien royalty. He didn't know Velthari customs around marriage, didn't understand what would be expected of him, was fairly certain he'd commit dozens of protocol violations before he even figured out what the protocols were. Sirana's response was gentle. She didn't need him to know how to be a traditional Velthari consort. She needed him to be what he'd been during the crisis, someone who saw her as a person rather than a princess, who kept his promises, who acted from genuine care rather than political calculation. They could figure out the rest together, learning as they went. Over the following days, the Empress was forced to accept reality. Her legal advisors confirmed there was no precedent for dissolving protection bonds without mutual agreement, and ancient Velthari law was very specific that such bonds were inviolable. They existed to recognize character proven under mortal peril, courage shown when calculation was impossible, compassion demonstrated when no reward could be expected, promises kept when breaking them would be understandable. The Empress announced the bonding publicly, though her displeasure was obvious to anyone who understood Velthari emotional displays. The reaction across Velthari society was mixed. Some viewed it as disgrace that their princess was bound to an outsider. Others found it romantic that she was bonded to someone who saved her life. Still others saw it as fascinating political development in human Velthari relations. Marcus began the challenging process of learning what being bonded to Princess Sirana actually meant. He had to learn court protocols that made human diplomatic etiquette look casual, understand the political landscape of the Velthari Empire's complex faction dynamics, figure out how to be partner to someone whose life was dominated by royal duties and constant public scrutiny. He faced skepticism from traditional nobles, who saw him as inappropriate consort, lacking the warrior credentials or political connections that Velthari culture valued. Some of Sirana's own supporters thought she could have done better politically, that the protection bond, while legally binding, represented missed opportunities for strategic alliances through more conventional marriage. But Marcus also discovered that his outsider perspective was valuable in ways he hadn't anticipated. As a xenolinguist and cultural mediator, he understood communication and cross-cultural dynamics with depth that helped Sirana navigate increasingly complex multi-species political landscape. His lack of investment in Velthari internal politics meant he could offer advice without factional bias. His genuine care for Sirana as a person rather than political asset gave her space to be herself that she rarely had in court settings where every interaction carried political weight. Their relationship developed over months from awkward strangers bound by cultural accident into genuine partnership. They learned about each other beyond the crisis that brought them together. Sirana discovered that Marcus was brilliant in his field, passionate about understanding how different species communicated, and surprisingly funny once he relaxed enough to show personality beyond professional courtesy. Marcus learned that Sirana was not just the beautiful princess, but a thoughtful leader deeply committed to her people's welfare, isolated by her position in ways that made his companionship genuinely valuable, and remarkably patient with his ongoing struggles to understand Velthari customs that she'd grown up with. 2 years after the crisis that had bound them, when the Empress finally acknowledged publicly that the bonding had actually been beneficial for her daughter, giving her a partner who valued her as a person, bringing fresh perspectives to Velthari governance, creating unprecedented close cultural ties with human institutions, she privately admitted to Marcus that she'd been wrong. Not about the situation being irregular or politically complicated, but about whether he was worthy of her daughter. He'd proven himself through consistent character rather than dramatic gestures, exactly what the ancient protection bond tradition was meant to recognize. The story ended with Marcus reflecting on how a few words spoken in crisis, meant only to comfort someone facing death, had completely changed his life. He'd gone from comfortable scholar's existence to being consort to alien princess, bound by promises he didn't know he was making but couldn't regret now that he understood their full meaning. He'd learned that sometimes the most important commitments are ones we make without realizing it. That honor means keeping promises even when they lead to complicated places, and that genuine bonds formed through trust and courage in crisis moments can prove stronger than any carefully planned strategic alliance. Princess Sirana, now fully accepted by her people with Marcus as her acknowledged consort, reflected that her mother's initial fury had been based on not understanding what Sirana had known from the moment Marcus stayed with her during that crisis. That someone who shows genuine courage and compassion without expectation of reward is exactly who should stand beside a future ruler. The protection bond had given her a choice, and she'd chosen someone whose character was proven through actions rather than just claimed through words. A reminder that trust earned in genuine crisis reveals truest character, that unintended commitments made honorably can lead to unexpected fulfillment, and that sometimes traditions exist to recognize that bonds formed through courage and integrity matter more than bonds formed through political convenience.